He froze. The sensation was unmistakable. A pull, as if something deep beneath Still Pocket Reservoir had reached through time just to touch him again. Slowly, Elijah Ward knelt, brushed the dust from the lid and opened it. The smell rose first. Old cedar, river mud, and a faint metallic note he remembered all too well. Inside lay a single photograph, faded, cracked at the edges, but painfully clear where it mattered. Two boys stood on a weathered dock at Still Pocket. One of them was Elijah, 10 years old, shoelaces undone, smile too big for his face. The other, Matthew Hale, had disappeared that same afternoon. Elijah's breath caught as he traced Matthew's silhouette. He had avoided this photo his whole life, but now it felt alive again, as if the paper itself exhaled the past. But it wasn't the boys that made his stomach twist. It was the water behind them, dark, glassy, unnaturally still. There, warped but unmistakable, was the outline of a third figure, tall, leaning forward, watching the boys from the waterline. A figure Elijah had no memory of, a figure no one in town had ever mentioned, not once, in all the years of questions, theories, and silent shame. He brought the photo closer to the light, his pulse hammered. The angle of the shot was wrong, too distant, too high, too deliberate. Someone had taken that picture, someone who was with them on the dock that day, someone Elijah had erased from memory or been made to forget. The walls of the small Salem house seemed to tighten around him. The floor creaked under his knees. Outside, the early Oregon rain began tapping at the window like fingertips. He swallowed hard. If he never remembered another person there, then who was holding the camera? A cold shiver crept up his spine. Something old and unspoken stirred in the air, as if the reservoir itself had leaned in to listen. And just before the truth could form on his tongue, the question rose again, heavy, familiar, terrifying. What really happened at Still Pocket that day? Before we begin, comment which state you're watching from.
Long before smartphones, before the internet hummed in every corner of the world, Salem, Oregon was a quieter place, especially on the south side of town, where the houses were modest, the porches creaked, and the smell of wet cedar drifted through every street after a night of rain. It was the late 1980s, a time when children disappeared into the neighborhood after breakfast and returned only when porch lights flickered on at dusk. Back then, the Línea d'Agua Reservoir wasn't just a body of water. It was a world of its own, a place where boys fished with makeshift rods, skipped stones, and dared each other to stand on the old metal dock that groaned under their weight. The forest around it was thick, moss-covered, and strangely comforting, its shadows long, its silence deeper than anything they would understand until much later. The protagonist, back then a scruffy, wide-eyed boy, lived in a small house with peeling blue paint and a mother who worked double shifts at a nearby cannery. She was gentle, tired, and always smelled faintly of laundry soap. Their home was humble, but warm in the way only the homes of the late 80s could be. Mismatched chairs, a humming refrigerator, a radio playing softly in the kitchen window. And then there was Ethan Ward, quiet, clever, a little strange at times, but brilliant in ways kids rarely recognized in each other. Ethan lived 2 streets over, in a house where the grass always seemed too tall and the curtains stayed drawn even on sunny days. His family was small, just him and his father, a man who often stared at the horizon as if waiting for something that never arrived. That summer, the boys spent every waking hour together, running barefoot through the muddy trails, trading baseball cards on the wooden steps of Ethan's porch, dreaming of growing up, leaving Salem, and coming back only when they wanted to. No one knew that before the season ended. A single afternoon at the reservoir would change everything, tearing the town and one boy's life in two. The past was simpler until the day it wasn't. The past has a strange way of hiding itself behind soft edges, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. For most of his adult life, he believed he had made peace with his childhood, filed it neatly away in some far corner of memory, blurred enough not to hurt, clear enough not to disappear entirely. But the photo he found in that box tugged at a thread he never meant to touch again. Back in Salem, Oregon, in the summer of 1988, the world felt different, bigger, louder, yet somehow safer. He was 10 years old, a boy with scraped knees, crooked smiles, and a habit of carrying too many stones in his pockets. He spent most days exploring the outskirts of town, where the pavement cracked into gravel and the gravel dissolved into trails leading straight to the Línea d'Agua Reservoir. He wasn't alone. Ethan Ward was always with him. Ethan was unlike anyone else in their group of friends, though in truth, they didn't really have a group. It was just the two of them most days. Ethan didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice carried a quiet seriousness unusual for his age. He noticed things others didn't: the way wind moved across the surface of the water, the patterns birds made before landing, the echo that returned when he shouted toward the trees. He once told him that the reservoir had a memory of its own. The protagonist had laughed it off then. Now, decades later, he wasn't sure. Their friendship was simple. They fished with strings tied to sticks. They built forts out of fallen branches. They took turns daring each other to step closer to the edge of the metal dock, a heap of rust and bolts that moaned under their feet like something trying to wake up. His home life was noisy in its own way. His mother was kind but exhausted, her hands always chapped from factory work. She tried her best to give him a childhood, but there were moments when the cupboards were emptier than he liked to remember. Nights when the electricity flickered. Mornings when he'd run to Ethan's house just to escape the heaviness in the air. Ethan's home was different, quiet to the point of eeriness. The house was old, paint stripped from the shutters, a thin crack running across the porch like a scar. The curtains were always drawn, even on warm days when sunlight could have warmed the rooms. And Ethan's father, well, the man was polite in a distant way, always staring at the floor longer than he looked at either boy. Sometimes, the protagonist wondered if Ethan was lonely or simply used to silence. One early morning, years before the tragedy, Ethan showed him a little leather-bound notebook. The edges were frayed, the cover scratched. He said it belonged to his mother, who had passed away when he was too young to remember her. Inside were sketches, mostly landscapes, trees, water, reflections, but one drawing stood out, a sketch of two boys standing at the reservoir's edge, despite being drawn years before they met. Ethan said it was just a coincidence, and the protagonist had believed him at the time. But as he recalls it now, that drawing feels heavier, almost prophetic. Back in childhood, though, the weight of symbolism meant nothing. What mattered were the small adventures, the tiny victories, like the time they borrowed a broken flashlight and pretended to search for treasure near the water, or the day they found a rusted coin buried in the mud and spent hours imagining the world it came from. Still, not everything in their past was light. There were days when Ethan seemed troubled. He'd stare off across the reservoir with a look the protagonist didn't understand. Sometimes he spoke as if he expected something to happen, something big, something unseen. Once, he even said he heard voices in the water, not whispers, but something else, something deeper. The protagonist didn't know what to do with those words then. He was just a boy. And then there was the memory he never spoke about, not even to himself. The afternoon when Ethan appeared at school with a bruise along his forearm. He brushed it off, saying he'd slipped on the dock. But the protagonist had seen the way Ethan's father avoided looking at it. He didn't question it. Children rarely question the things they fear might be true. As the summer approached its end, the air grew heavier, colder in the mornings, the fog rolling in thicker over the reservoir. The boys kept meeting every day, clinging to the last stretch of sunlight before school started again. And then came the last week, the week everything would break. They didn't know it at the time, but the reservoir did. Sometimes when he thinks back, he wonders if Ethan sensed it, if the boy's strange quietness wasn't just a personality trait, but a warning. Decades later, the photograph burns in his hands like evidence of something he never understood, something buried under years of denial and silence. And in the reflection on the water behind them, that faint silhouette feels less like a trick of light and more like a memory fighting to surface, a memory he never meant to remember. The week everything changed began with a storm that hadn't yet arrived. It was late August of 1988, Oregon's final stretch of summer, when the mornings were still warm, but the evenings carried the quiet tremor of the coming fall. The leaves hadn't yet turned, but something in the air felt different, like the world was pausing before a shift no one could stop. He remembered waking that Monday to a strange stillness. No birds, no wind. Even the old maple tree outside his window seemed frozen, its branches unmoving against a pale sky. His mother left early for work, leaving a note on the kitchen table reminding him to reheat the leftover soup for lunch. He read it, nodded to no one, and stepped outside just as Ethan appeared at the end of the street. Something was wrong. wrong. He saw it immediately. Ethan wasn't carrying his backpack. His shirt wasn't tucked the way his father always insisted. And his eyes, usually alert, scanning everything around him, looked dull, as if he hadn't slept. "What happened?" he asked. Ethan shrugged. "Nothing. Let's go." But it wasn't nothing. A child may not understand everything, but they recognize when a friend is carrying a heaviness that doesn't belong to them. That entire week, Ethan drifted through their days like a shadow. He spoke less, laughed almost never, and jumped at sounds that never used to bother him. And every afternoon, without fail, he insisted they go to the Linha d'Agua reservoir, even when the sky darkened and thunder rolled far in the distance. "We shouldn't be here," he said once, his voice barely above a whisper as they stood on the creaking metal dock. "But I have to come back. I need to figure it out." "Figure what out?" the protagonist asked. But Ethan just stared into the water as though it might speak back. On Wednesday, the first crack appeared between them. The protagonist was running late. His mother had asked him to help carry groceries home, and when he reached the reservoir, Ethan was already on the dock, pacing, his small hands pulling at his hair. "You weren't here," Ethan snapped when he saw him. "I'm here now," the boy said, confused. "But you weren't here." There was something frightening about the intensity in Ethan's face. He wasn't angry. He was desperate. The protagonist tried to laugh it off, but Ethan didn't smile. "You don't understand," Ethan said, stepping closer. "We don't have much time left." "Time for what?" the boy wanted to ask, but the metallic groan of the dock beneath their feet wiped the words from his mouth. On Thursday, things got worse. School felt tense. Ethan didn't speak to him all morning, not during recess, not at lunch. He sat alone under the awning behind the cafeteria, staring out at the tree line. When the protagonist finally worked up the courage to sit beside him, Ethan whispered something he'd never forget. "If something happens, don't come looking for me." A chill crawled down his back. "Why would something happen?" he asked. Ethan didn't answer. That night, thunder cracked over Salem. The rain came heavy, pounding roofs, filling gutters, and pooling along the streets. The reservoir swelled under the weight of it, dark, restless, rising. Friday was the last day of the boy's childhood innocence. It began like any other. A cold breakfast, a little rain, the smell of damp earth stretching through the neighborhood. The boys met at the edge of the woods that led to the reservoir, but something was different. Ethan wasn't alone. His father was there. The man stood behind him with an expression the protagonist couldn't decipher, part exhaustion, part irritation, part something else he didn't recognize. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders hunched as though he wanted to disappear into himself. "Ethan," the man said sharply. "Home, now." Ethan didn't move. "We'll be quick," Ethan insisted. "We just want to see the water." His father's jaw tightened. The protagonist felt pressure building between them, a tension that prickled the air. Finally, the man stepped back, exhaling hard. 15 minutes, he said, "and then you come straight home." The boys walked deeper into the woods until the sound of the man's footsteps faded. The reservoir appeared through the trees, larger than usual, its surface churning slightly from the night storm. Ethan stopped at the shoreline. "This is where it happened," he murmured. "What happened?" He pointed to the water. "The thing I've been trying to figure out." The protagonist stepped closer. "Ethan, you're scaring me." "You should be scared," Ethan replied. "Because I think it's coming back." A sudden gust of wind swept across the water, cold enough to sting their faces. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. And then Ethan pulled something from his pocket, a small metal object the protagonist had never seen before. It was a key, rusted, heavy, with a strange symbol scratched into the side. "I found this," Ethan said, "in my house, in a box that wasn't supposed to be there. What does it open?" "I don't know." Before he could ask another question, a voice echoed from the trees. "Ethan!" His father's shout carried panic. The boy clutched the key tight. "I have to go," he whispered. "Meet me here tomorrow, same time. I'll show you everything." He ran toward the sound of his father's voice, disappearing into the trees before the protagonist could stop him. That was the last time he saw Ethan alive. A break had opened, a tier between what they once were and what the world was about to become. The reservoir held its breath. The sky darkened. The air thickened with a truth neither boy was ready for. And the key Ethan carried would never be seen again. Not until decades later, when the truth finally surfaced, when the protagonist opened the wooden box and remembered everything he had tried to forget. The following Saturday arrived with an unnatural stillness, as if Salem itself were holding its breath. The mist rolled in from the Willamette River before sunrise, draping the small town in a pale shroud. Elijah stepped out of his truck carrying two things he had not touched in decades: shades, a rusted lantern, and Matthew's old red bandana, faded, fraying, but still holding the faint scent of summer pine if he pressed it close enough. He wasn't alone this time. Detective Nora Hale, now retired but still sharp-eyed, stood waiting near the gravel trail that led into the old logging woods. Her gray hair fluttered slightly in the cold wind. She had been the only officer who believed Elijah back in 1985. The only one who said the river didn't just take children, something else did. "I thought you burned that lantern," she murmured. "I tried," Elijah replied. "But some things don't leave us even when we ask." They walked the narrow path as the trees groaned overhead, bending like aging guardians. A crow cawed once. Then silence returned, a silence so full it felt pressurized. Somewhere between the trees, the air carried the haunting smell of wet stones and rust. Elijah's pulse tightened. It was the same smell as the day Matthew vanished. Nora stopped abruptly. "Elijah, look!" Half buried between roots, twisted like skeletal fingers, was a small wooden sign, splintered by time. The words were barely visible, carved by an unsteady hand. "Keep away from the water line. He watches at night." It wasn't there in 1985. Elijah would have remembered. The carving was old, but not that old. 10, maybe 15 years at most. Someone else had seen something. Someone else had tried to warn. They continued, tension rising with each step until the forest opened into a narrow clearing where the river curved inward, forming what locals once called the Still Pocket, a quiet pool where water barely moved, the place where Matthew had been seen last. But now 4 things waited for them on the shore. 4 objects. 4 impossibilities. Elijah knelt as his breath fractured. Spread across the wet stones, arranged with intention, as if placed gently, lay a small metal toy boat, corroded but unmistakable. A Polaroid photograph of the river, taken at night. A boy's muddy sneaker, the exact model sold in the mid-'80s, and a strip of red cloth tied carefully into a knot. Nora crouched beside him. "Elijah, this wasn't here yesterday. I checked the shoreline myself." He reached for the cloth with trembling fingers, expecting it to crumble under his touch. But it didn't. The knot was tight, purposeful, almost recent. A deep vibration traveled through the soil. Not an earthquake, more like the slow exhale of something enormous beneath the surface. Nora drew her gun. "Elijah, step back." The water rippled, though the wind was still. Ripples grew into small circular waves, each one radiating outward from a dark point at the pool's center, like a pupil dilating. "That's impossible," Nora whispered. "Nothing's supposed to move here." Elijah felt the same suffocating pressure he had felt as a boy. When Matthew screamed, when the water swallowed sound itself, when something beneath it shifted. Then, from the depths, something rose. Not a creature, not fully, a shape. A silhouette of a boy's head, just beneath the surface, pale and motionless, eyes open, as if looking up, as if waiting. Elijah's legs nearly gave out. "Matthew?" The river blinked, not the boy, the water, as if the pool itself were responding. Nora grabbed Elijah's arm harshly, dragging him back. "That's not your brother. Don't you dare step closer." But the pale shape didn't sink. It drifted, slowly, deliberately, to the shoreline, toward Elijah, carrying with it a faint, hollow echo of a child's laugh, muffled and distant, like sound traveling through a long, wet tunnel. Elijah stumbled backward. "That laugh, did you hear that? Nora, tell me you heard it." Nora didn't answer. She couldn't. She was staring at something behind him. "Elijah," she whispered, voice broken. "Look at the trees." The trunks around the clearing were bleeding. Not blood, water. Thin streams trickling down their bark, as if the forest itself were sweating in fear, and carved into the nearest trunk, fresh enough to glisten. He never left the water, and he is not alone. Elijah felt the world tilt, past, present, fear, memory all collapsing into one. If Matthew truly never left the river, then what had taken his place? The news spread through Salem faster than wildfire in a dry summer. By Monday morning, the entire town was whispering about the thing in the river. Most hadn't seen it, only Elijah and Nora had. But fear didn't need proof. It just needed a story, and Salem had always been full of those. 1. The first theory. Old fears. Resurrected. Elijah sat at the dining table of his childhood home, surrounded by newspaper clippings and old police reports. The house creaked around him with the slow tiredness of a place that had carried too many ghosts. Nora paced across the small kitchen, arms crossed, frustration tightening her jaw. "People are saying it's the River Watcher again," she muttered. Elijah looked up. "That old myth? Nobody believed it back then." "People didn't. But they told the stories anyway," Nora replied. She leaned against the counter. "Remember? The idea that something lived beneath Still Pocket. Something that pulled down anything that wandered too close." Elijah rubbed his temples. "My mother used to say it was just to keep kids away from the water." Nora nodded. "And maybe it was, but whatever we saw wasn't a myth, and the town is filling in the blanks with whatever makes sense to them." Outside the window, a group of teenagers on bikes stopped at the fence, pointing toward the woods. One boy mimicked a drowning motion. Another pretended to be dragged by invisible hands. Fear had become entertainment, just like in 85. 2. The second theory. Science trying to make sense of the impossible. Nora opened a file she had brought from her house. Old sonar readings, map surveys, subsurface analyses from the 90s. "Elijah, look at this." She placed a scanned image on the table. A sonar sweep of Still Pocket from 1993. The depth contour lines were uniform, except for one section, a perfect vertical drop, like a shaft, a tunnel. "Elijah, Still Pocket isn't just a dip in the riverbed. It's a carved-out cavity, and bodies of water don't just do that naturally." His breath hitched. "You think something carved it? I think something is inside it." Elijah stared at the sonar image. The shape looked wrong, too smooth, too precise, almost architectural. "It would explain why Matthew's body was never found," Nora said. "It would explain why the water moves only when, whatever it is, stirs." But she didn't have to say the rest. The implication hung in the air. If something made that cavity, then it had a purpose. And if Matthew was taken, maybe others were too. 3. The third theory. The people who remembered the next day, Elijah and Nora visited the one place they had always avoided, the Salem Senior Lodge, where many of the oldest residents, those alive before the 60s, still gathered. Old Mrs. Halpern sat near the window, knitting as rain tapped against the glass. Her eyes were pale as winter clouds, but sharp. "You're here because of the river," she said, before they even asked. "Just like your father came in 85. Elijah froze. "My father never told me he spoke to anyone." "He did. He wanted answers, just like you." Nora stepped closer. "Mrs. Halpern, do you remember anything unusual about Still Pocket? Anything strange from your childhood?" The old woman's lips tightened. "You're asking the wrong question, dear." She set down her knitting needles. "It wasn't Still Pocket. It was what came before Still Pocket." Elijah frowned. "What do you mean?" "Before the river curved there," she said, "that land was dry, dry as bone. And in those days there was an old sawmill near that spot. Workers went missing, tools went missing, entire shipments of lumber vanished." She swallowed. "And sometimes, at night, the ground shook." Nora and Elijah exchanged a look. "So you're saying," Nora whispered, "that whatever is under the water now was already there before the river even reached it?" Mrs. Halpern nodded, slow, fearful. "You can flood the land," she said, "but you cannot drown what was already awake." 4. The fourth theory. The ones who lie. That night, Elijah returned home to find a plain white envelope shoved under his door. No name, no return address. Inside was a single note, typed, "Stop digging. He does not take kindly to disturbance. The child you saw is not your brother." Elijah felt the air leave his chest. Not fear, rage. Someone knew, someone had seen, someone had been watching them at the river. He turned the paper over, nothing. But when he held it near the lamp, faint indents appeared on the back. Someone had written another message before typing the visible one. He shaded the page with a pencil until the marks revealed themselves. "He wants you back. Just like before." Elijah dropped the paper as a shiver ran through him. Before? What did before mean? 5. The fifth theory. The world beyond Salem. By morning, 2 drone videos had leaked online, grainy, shaky footage taken by teens who flew cameras over Still Pocket at night. Both videos showed the same chilling phenomenon. The water pulsed in a rhythmic pattern, like breathing, in and out, in and out. The comment sections exploded. River monster confirmed? This is why Oregon gives off horror movie vibes. Fake, obviously, that's CGI. Bro, the trees are dripping water. How do you fake that? Within hours, small-time paranormal YouTubers drove into Salem with selfie sticks and microphones. A documentary crew followed. Conspiracy forums lit up like wildfire. Everyone had a version, a theory, a story, but none of them had the truth. Only Elijah had seen the pale boy under the water. Only Elijah had heard the laugh. And only Elijah knew what the bandana meant. The final moment of Chapter 4. That evening, as Elijah prepared to lock his door, he saw movement at the far end of the street. A child, standing perfectly still in the rain, barefoot, dripping water, wearing a red bandana. Elijah's heart stopped. He took a step forward, and the child vanished. Not by running, not by hiding. He faded, like mist being pulled backward by some invisible tide, not human, not memory, not imagination. And Elijah knew without a doubt. The theories weren't trying to explain the truth. The truth was rewriting itself. Psychological tension. The rain had finally stopped by the time Elijah reached Still Pocket again. The forest stood dark and swollen with moisture, the air thick with the earthy smell of moss and old bark. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked, a soft, deliberate sound, as though the woods themselves were shifting to watch him return. He knew he shouldn't be there alone. He knew Nora would have tried to stop him, but some truths demanded solitude. And after what he had just seen on his street, after the dripping boy with the red bandana faded into the air, Elijah understood something he had denied for decades. This wasn't about the past. It was about unfinished business. His unfinished business. 1. The water that remembers. The dock groaned under Elijah's weight as he stepped onto it. The moon reflected over Still Pocket like a dull gray coin floating in an ink well. No ripples, no breath, no signs of life. And yet, he felt it. That subtle pull behind his ribs. A current that wasn't water. A memory. Elijah. The voice wasn't from the trees. It wasn't from the wind. It rose from beneath the surface, soft as a lullaby, familiar as a childhood secret. He squeezed the red bandana in his hand until his knuckles whitened. "Matthew," he whispered. "Where are you?" When the water finally moved, it did so with slow intention, circling, spiraling, creating a wide ring as if something immense awakened deep beneath. A pale face emerged just below the surface. Matthew, eyes open, calm, almost peaceful. "Elijah, you came back." Elijah dropped to his knees. "You're alive?" His voice cracked. "Matthew, God, what did he do to you? Who took you? Tell me what happened that day." The water stilled. Matthew blinked slowly, like someone waking from a lifelong sleep. "He didn't take me, Elijah," the boy murmured. "You did." 2. The other memory. The one he never let himself see. Elijah's breath caught. "That's not true," he whispered. "I tried to save you. I was just a kid. I didn't know." Matthew shook his head gently, sending ripples across the surface. "No, you saw something first, before I slipped, before the water pulled me." His voice softened. "You screamed, Elijah. I saw your face. I saw the fear. And then I felt it too." Elijah staggered backward. "I don't remember that." Matthew looked at him with haunting clarity. "That's because he took the memory from you. The river doesn't just drown bodies. It drowns truths. He pulls what he wants." He paused. "And he wanted you even more than he wanted me." A cold shiver climbed Elijah's spine. Who is he? Matthew's expression shifted. No longer childlike, but ancient. Older than any face Elijah had ever seen. He is the part of Salem that never died. The thing under the mill. The thing that drank the land before the river ever arrived. He raised a hand from beneath the water. A small, trembling hand. But his shadow under the surface was wrong. Too large, too warped. When we were kids, you heard him too. Remember the humming? The vibrating dock? The laughter? Elijah shook his head violently. No, that was just the river. It wasn't the river, Matthew whispered. It was him calling you. 3. The real secret. Why Salem never let him go. Elijah, Matthew's voice dragged like wet gravel. He's not finished with you. The water around the dock began to spiral again, deep, thunderous, unnatural. Trees bent inward as though leaning to witness what came next. Elijah gripped the wooden planks. Why me? Matthew's pale face tilted, because you're the one who survived the first time. Elijah felt his world twist. What do you mean? I never... But the flash came anyway, a buried memory breaking free. He saw himself, 7 years old, standing on the dock, Matthew beside him, the water eerily still, then a massive shape rising beneath them, like the river itself was exhaling. A voice, not heard but felt, coiling inside Elijah's skull. Come home! Matthew slipped. But it wasn't water that pulled him under. It was a hand, long, pale, and unmistakably familiar. Elijah staggered as realization stabbed through him. The creature didn't choose Matthew. It chose him. Matthew was only taken because he reached for Elijah's arm, and Elijah pulled away in terror. It should have been Elijah, and the river never forgot. 4. The last request. Elijah, Matthew whispered. I'm not trapped. I'm part of him now, but you still have a choice. The water rose slightly, lifting Matthew's face closer to the surface. Walk away, the boy said. Leave Salem forever. Don't look back. If you stay, he will take you, this time completely. Elijah's heart hammered. But if I walk away, what happens to you? Matthew smiled, not a human smile, but a soft, hollow curve of acceptance. I'm already where I belong. 5. The moment of truth. The water surged violently, dark waves slamming the edges of the dock. The forest seemed to inhale. Elijah Ward, a vast, layered voice echoed from below. You were promised. A massive shadow rose beneath the surface. Elijah stepped back, then stopped. He stared at Matthew, at the boy he left behind, at the truth he had buried for decades, and for the first time, he didn't run. I wasn't promised, Elijah whispered. I was a child, and I survived. The water roared. Elijah took a final breath, then dropped the red bandana into the river. It floated for a moment, then sank like a stone. Matthew's face faded with it, and the water went still, silent, watching, waiting. Elijah turned and walked away, into the trees, into the trembling night, knowing something ancient had been denied what it wanted most. But as he reached the forest edge, a cold whisper curled against his ear. I will wait, rivers remember. And Elijah knew the truth. Some silences are not endings. They are promises. Morning broke gently over Salem, casting a soft gold haze across the treetops. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet pine and quiet earth. Elijah stood at the edge of the old trail, watching sunlight spill through the branches in slow, trembling beams. For the first time in decades, Still Pocket did not pull at him. It simply existed, a gray mirror hidden between moss and memory. He held no bandana now, no clues, no ghosts from childhood tucked inside his coat. Only silence. a silence that felt less like a threat and more like an unresolved melody. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he was 10 again. Mud on his shoes, wind on his face, laughter trailing behind him, and Matthew like a ribbon. Back when summers lasted forever, when the world was small, and the river was just a place to cool their feet. Time had stolen that innocence. The river had swallowed the rest. But as Elijah breathed in the crisp Oregon air, he understood something old and gentle. Not every mystery exists to be solved. Some exist to teach us what we lost, and what we're still capable of holding on to. The water behind him rippled, subtle, almost affectionate, like a farewell from something ancient and patient. Elijah didn't turn around. He walked the old trail back toward town, toward the life he'd left behind, toward whatever waited next. And though the forest swallowed his footsteps, one truth settled quietly in his chest. You can leave the river, but the river never truly leaves you. A final echo. A final promise, carried by the wind through the cedar trees.